And P&O was a sort of umbilical cord. It was something that linked home to where we lived. And one regarded it really as a part of life. P&O or Orient. There was a ship a week calling in there. And this was the entry into the real world.
P&O voyage, a P&O ship, was very like the little world of a fish in India on the sea.
And when I was born, they said, well, when the lad grows up, we'll put him in the P&O. And I was very glad that they did so.
If you knew something about travelling to the Far East, you would reserve your cabin on the port side according to where the prevailing wind came from, and on the starboard side for the return journey. And the two things together were combined and became known as POSH. And if you were lucky enough and rich enough to travel first class each time, you had a splendid trip. But they rather fancied themselves over the other lines.
You waited on hand and foot, and knee and elbow as well sometimes, like this. And it was a new experience. Suddenly you became important. In England, we weren't important. When we went to India, and we were important on board the ship.
Well, there were three shipping companies. They used to say there was the Royal Navy, the Merchant Navy, and the P&O. You know, sort of. So I think P&O, everybody considered it was the sort of top shipping company.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to join me in a toast? If you'd like to raise your glasses to the P&O and long may it flourish.
This year, the Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company celebrates its 150th anniversary. The genesis of P&O was here in the Shetland Islands, in Scotland's far north. In 1792, in this oddly named house, the Bod of Gremister, one of P&O's two founders, Arthur Anderson, was born. His first job was curing fish. Then he joined the Navy. But when his ship was paid off after Waterloo, he walked to London to seek work. There he was taken on, first as clerk, then as partner, by a fellow Scot and shipbroker, Brodie Wilcox.
Together, they made a very telling combination. Wilcox had the more cautious bookkeeping outlook. Anderson had the ideas and the panache and the drive, I think, to carry them through. They laid down the groundwork for an industry, a company, which has lasted for a century and a half.
In the Shetlands, Anderson had put forward proposals for a ferry service to the mainland, but the government had rejected them. Then in 1834, he and Wilcox launched their first seagoing venture, an irregular freight and passenger service to the Spanish Peninsula. They knew that the only way for their small fleet to make money was by securing the contract to carry the Royal Mail, and they gambled on the government not allowing their newborn Peninsula Steam Navigation Line to go out of business.
The government needed communications. It subsidized these industries, these companies, not just P&O, but Cunard, the Royal West India Mail Company. Government was aware that in a growing international economy with all sorts of influences, they had to have direct and regular communication. So it was really government intervention which actually made the thing work.
And in August 1837, just 150 years ago, the two Scots gained the contract to carry the Royal Mail to the Spanish Peninsula. But what followed was a disaster that could have killed the fledgling at birth. The very first ship to carry the mail, the Don Juan, with Arthur Anderson on board and homeward bound from Gibraltar, ran aground in a fog on the Spanish coast. But Anderson rescued the mail, hired a Spanish fishing boat to take it to Gibraltar, and there persuaded the captain of a British warship to carry it home. The day was saved. With the line to Cadiz now operating at a profit, Wilcox and Anderson set their sights further afield, first to Alexandria and then beyond to the Orient. But these routes were dominated by the legendary East India Company. Its great square riggers symbolized Britain's domination of the seas, but being dependent on the winds, they took 6 months to reach India. Wilcox and Anderson's reply was to build the Hindustan, a steam-driven paddle ship, and she made the passage to India in less than half the time of the East Indiaman. Others followed, and the Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, as it was now called, was firmly established. It was the new side-lever steam engine that was the key of Wilcox and Anderson's success. Steam also enabled P&O to plan regular schedules. Passengers whose arrivals or departures had previously depended on the fickleness of the winds could now plan their journeys. But this new technology brought its own problems. A conflict in the officers' pecking order between those who worked above deck and those who worked below it. It was to last for more than a century.
I suppose the sailormen didn't want the engineers, and then the engineers began to prove that without them we wouldn't get very far.
There was a slight animosity between the deck department and the engineers. Some deck officers, we'll call them, had a superiority attitude. They seemed to have the feeling that because they were seldom in unsoiled clothes, they were superior to engineers who had to repair machinery, and you can't repair machinery in the best of clothes.
In the evening, when it got a little cooler, they'd turn the ship around and you'd go back so as to promote a draft to cool the ship off. It was that hot. I mean, the passengers may have complained, but it was nothing to what went on down below in the stokehold.
Often, certain parts of the engine room, the temperature would be 130, and you had to carry out repairs even at sea, and you could only work for about 10 minutes. So what you had to do was to work for 10 minutes, come down ladders down to the engine room underneath a blower for 5 or 10 minutes to cool off, and then go back to that same unit again.
And every morning I used to get up very early, and they used to have lascars in blue with a little red turban on top, and they would sand the decks every morning and sand the side of the ship's rails. All the brass was polished. By the time people got up in the morning at 6, and they used to get very early on a ship, the ship was sparkling from beginning to end.
We are part and parcel of P&O because we work for generations for the P&O, and so we are used to it, this job. It's not something new to us.
For more than 100 years, P&O obtained its crews from the countries it served. The Lascar deck crews were Hindus, recruited from their villages by local middlemen.
They treated them, there's no doubt about it, these were a source of very competent but exploited labour. The ability of those crews was remarkable, and the commitment also. And it ran through whole villages, and whole generations of these people served loyally and tremendously capably for P&O.
Coal was the fuel that powered P&O's early steamers, first for the side lever engine, and then in the 1850s for propellers positioned astern. This meant bigger and bigger ships. Like P&O's Himalaya, which was twice the size of any previous P&O ship, 340 feet long, 3,500 tons dead weight. For a time, she was the largest ship in the world. Her consumption of coal was prodigious, 70 tons a day. In today's money, this cost the P&O fleet more than £14 million a year. The extension of operations to Australia and the Far East necessitated 14 separate coaling stations and a fleet of 170 sailing colliers to keep their stocks topped up.
Here is this constant succession of little brown men carrying huge sacks of coal in an endless stream like ants up the gangway to take the sack inside and deposit it and come out to pick up another one later. It went on all night, and the air was full of strange cries and coal dust and the lights of flares and plenty of coal dust. Everything was shut that could be shut, but the whole ship had to be washed down after that. And it took about 24 hours to get it clean again.
As well as the coal dust, and for passengers more than the crew, there was a more traditional discomfort to contend with.
The days passed, as you may imagine, slowly and disagreeably, the weather still continuing very unfavourable.
I did not sleep much. My berth being a top one, I felt the motion of the ship very much.
Dressing was troublesome. I bumped my head against the top of my berth, and then descending to the floor to put on my shirt, I fell headfirst into my companion's bed. The sun brought all the sick people out of their berths, and the indescribable moans and noises which had been issuing from behind the fine painted doors happily ceased.
And when the sea was kind, the leisured classes enjoyed the sort of leisurely activities they were used to at home.
We were very formal in India, very important who was senior and who was junior and all that. And they rather kept that up on the P&O. The grand people sat at the captain's table, and the lesser people sat elsewhere.
I'm afraid that is a bit of snobbery. You just couldn't travel third class because, I mean, there was such a difference. You see, the ship was divided. Only 1/4 was given to the tourist class, and the first class passengers had a seaman there to make sure that them didn't come in with us.
In fact, the tourist class, quite honestly, was much more lively for a young assistant purser than the rather stuffy first class. You know, people let their hair down a bit more.
Oh, absolutely, because there they had all sorts of fun there. We went down there. We didn't want to be snobs. We joined them and on every available opportunity.
We were second class because my father wasn't an officer, Logue. And when we used to dance on the deck, the officers, the yuppies of the days, they used to stand and watch us like we were the cabaret, like this. We never got forward to the first part of the first class ship. Some people broke through, got drunk and thrown back again, some party breakers.
I think years ago when my father was in the company, very few people expected to end the voyage with their pay in red because they had private means anyway. And it was probably the 4th or the 5th son went P&O when you'd run out of the Navy and the Army and the church. The company's rules were always strict. In fact, I think the 1934 rule book, which I initially grew up under, even stated that the commander, as the captain was then called, and officers would not play cards.
Well, it was a very formal and disciplined, marvellous, you know, very naval discipline. And the staff, the officers and so on, didn't mix at all with the travellers. And, you know, a polite good morning and is it going to be rough, yes or no, you know, but that was all.
Until the building of the Suez Canal, P&O passengers bound for India had to disembark at Alexandria, travel by boat to Cairo, then go 80 miles overland to join another ship at Suez. The company owned its own hotel in Cairo, and there were opportunities for passengers to go sightseeing. So that passengers could enjoy fresh food on their overland journey, P&O even ran its own farms. One of the early passengers to make that journey was the Victorian novelist William Thackeray.
Got up very early and found that the morning was beautiful. I wish I could say as much for the scenery by the river, which was flat and barren. At about 11 p.m., we went to the canal where we found a steam tug and a large track boat, into the latter of which we embarked.
We were surrounded by large numbers of the populace, who, as is usual there, talked, laughed, and quarrelled as loud as they could.
Looking ahead, in an hour or two, we saw the pyramids. There they lay, rosy and solemn in the distance, those old, majestical, mystical, familiar edifices.
From Cairo, mail and baggage were transported in camel caravans. The passengers went in vans, which the Times correspondent likened to Brighton bathing boxes placed longitudinally on wheels. When you consider the inconvenience of all this, it's surprising that P&O weren't more interested in the plans of the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps to build his Suez Canal. The British government were equally indifferent, believing that the existence of the canal would somehow diminish Britannia's command of the waves.
I think the great highlight of any voyage was going through the Suez Canal.
The canal was wonderful. I loved it, and I think most people did. For one thing, you were flat, quiet, calm, you see, I mean, like on a river. And you went very, very slowly down this extraordinary waterway with the desert stretching away right and left. You couldn't do two big ships passing each other. And that was rather exciting. You went into one of the little stations. They had little stations all the way down. And the ship was tied up, and you'd hear all these bells ringing from the bridge and everything.
And travelling through the Suez Canal as a boy, I'd never seen such a thing like travelling through a desert on a ship. It was, we had the Sinai on one side, and it was marvellous, absolutely wonderful. And the scorching heat.
And then getting to Port Said, when they open up the famous Simon Arts shop, whatever time the mailboat came in, night or day, Simon Arts would be opened for the passengers.
P&O flatly refused to believe that the canal would stay open. It was a mistake they lived to regret. 40,000 tons of their shipping with drafts too deep for the canal had to be scrapped, and 80,000 tons of new shipping with increased cargo capacity was laid down for building. In 1872, soon after the canal had opened, and with bankruptcy looming, P&O took on a new young chairman, Thomas Sutherland.
Sutherland came in, recognised what was happening, and by applying really a very, very rigorous management accountancy, if you like, he turned the company around. But he was a man who ran the company from the centre outwards, and every conceivable item in the late 19th century passed through his office, from quality of toilet paper to the size of new tonnage. And in a sense, that's how these companies managed to survive and sustain themselves, because people knew exactly what was going on. They were big, but not so big that you didn't actually lose control.
Under Sutherland, P&O grew and prospered. In the last years of the 19th century, its ships were steaming 2.5 million miles a year. In size and comfort, they exceeded anything that had gone before. It was during this period that the distinctive P&O profile of upright stem, 4 masts and 2 funnels was first established. There was a kind of timelessness about a voyage in a P&O ship, with standards of comfort and entertainment aping those of luxury hotels ashore. For many, it was a way of life which seemed as though it would never end. This sort of stylish traveling was possible because of government subsidies, but there was a good reason for them. In wartime, the government would requisition its ships.
And my father saw war coming and reckoned the simplest thing to do was to pack the whole family up. There were only 3 of us there, and Nanny, of course. Nanny was always there. And take us out to Australia where it might be safer. So we went through the Suez Canal in a P&O ship as war broke out, and I shall never forget, sort of thing that a boy of 3 will always remember, seeing a ship in the water, only the funnels and the masts. It had been sunk as a block ship, you see, in the Great Bitter Lake. But at the age of 3, there was something seen, never, never forgotten.
In the First World War, some P&O vessels were requisitioned as troop carriers and hospital ships. Others were taken into the Royal Navy as armed merchant cruisers to patrol the sea lanes and intercept blockade runners. They paid a heavy price. In 4 years of war, P&O lost a quarter of its entire fleet. One of the first ships to go was the Persia. On board her was the father of the present Lord Montagu.
The ship was torpedoed at 1 o'clock, just before lunch, and went down literally in 5 minutes because unfortunately the portholes of the dining room had been left open. And it was a tremendous schmozzle and everybody went down, and miraculously my father was saved, and due mainly to this thing called a Jeeves waistcoat, which was an inflatable army waistcoat which you had under your uniform. The boat itself, which he managed to scramble onto, had already been badly damaged and was full of lascars. And of course they were all dying to get his waistcoat because that was a great thing. In fact, one tried to murder him at one time and he was managed to prevent that. And one by one they died, either for drinking salt water, and my father recalls that he sat on one dead body for a while because it gave him a better height out of the water.
335 people died, but Lord Montagu survived to read his own obituary in the Times. But he lost his devoted companion, Eleanor Thornton, who as a girl had inspired the Rolls-Royce emblem, Spirit of Ecstasy. P&O gained one windfall from the war, generous government compensation for the loss of its ships, many of which were already out of date, thus enabling it to build for the future. By 1923, the fleet had increased to 500 ships, a rash expansion in view of the threat now posed by the growing merchant fleets of America and Japan. At this time also, P&O acquired several other shipping companies which allowed them to take cargo and passengers into new areas such as New Zealand and the West Indies. With the takeover of the Blue Anchor line, P&O found itself in the business of carrying to Australia thousands of Europeans who wanted to make new lives there. They called it the P&O branch line. Previously, the POSH P&O had largely ignored these emigrant passengers. Now, after Anderson and Sutherland, came the company's third great chairman, Lord Inchcape. He merged P&O with his own company, the larger British India Line. P&O kept its name, but had in effect been taken over.
He always put the P&O very high on his priorities. But he also enjoyed contacts he had with politicians and was very glad to offer politicians berths on P&O ships. People like Churchill and certainly Reading and Lord Northcliffe. Inchcape was well known for being rather penny-pinching, and he certainly asked what happened to a pat of butter which he'd left at breakfast when the steward came round at lunchtime. I was always very upset by things like butt ends of cigarettes on the decks. He hated any sort of sloppy behaviour, but also told off people for using too much sealing wax on envelopes. He died still trying to control the P&O and every single item of its business. He wanted to have every telex, every cable, all the correspondence. He wanted to know exactly what was happening.
Now, under Inchcape, came P&O's second heyday. The livery of its new ships, white hulls and buff funnels, reflected the gaiety and optimism of the age. The decor was apt to be Rococo and employed a variety of styles, from Scottish baronial to French Empire. They aimed to stun and did.
Well, I think you might say that I was the original carry-on cruising. I started when I was about 10. My father was a very busy doctor, and the only way he could get away from patients and telephone was to get on a ship. So every August we left our school uniforms in the convent, and mother, father, and 2 daughters proceeded to enjoy themselves cruising. We were so disciplined in the 30s. You can imagine my poor father going on board with 3 females. We had to have at least 7 evening dresses, 7 day dresses, 7 sports dresses, and of course, if we could get them in, a few other clothes.
My wife was a dressmaker, and so what she actually bought would be more patterns to make dresses, but it could be expensive. Some I must have found it very difficult because you could hardly wear the same dress, evening dress, 2 consecutive nights.
You saw me standing alone without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. Blue moon, you knew just what I was there for.
Most people fancied, apart from the luxury of traveling first class, were the wonderful meals and the tremendous selection you could get of dishes to eat. There was an enormous menu, and I remember they had a notice at the bottom saying, "There's nothing here that you fancy, just ask for it."
This little sort of Malayan used to go around with the little 4 little bells that went ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding, which meant breakfast was being served. And breakfast, as I remember, was an English breakfast: eggs and bacon, everything you'd get on land, kippers, porridge, Quaker oats, all that tea, bread and butter and marmalade. You could have been in a hotel at Shorncliffe.
And one thing we always had on the P&O and never on any other line was beef tea in the morning. Of course, you booked a long chair from the chief steward when you got on board, and you stretched out on it in the mornings with a rug around you, and you were brought beef tea at 11.
They had a big celebration dinner, and the thing that stands out in my mind there is that the dessert was an ice cream, which was served in the colours of the P&O, which, as you know, is red, white, blue, and the yellow. And I could get the other colours, but the blue, no way could I eat blue ice cream.
The P&O is full of activity because somebody always got up a games committee. And you had to join in all kinds of competitions, deck quoits and races with little wooden horses on the floor. But it was very, very serious, the games competitions, and really rather like Wimbledon, you know, who was going to win.
This picture that I have here was the first indoor swimming pool that any cruising ship had had. This chubby young person here was me, about 13 years old. And this was my elder sister here, poised to dive in the pool, but I can assure you that swimming costume never got wet.
Before the age of swimming pools, they used to put up a great canvas derrick on the ship and pump in seawater like this, and we used to dive in and swim across them. And I learned to swim at that time. And the other big thing was there was a rope which hung across this swimming pool. And this saying became famous later on in the Goon Show, believe it or not. My brother, who couldn't swim, used to jump onto this rope and go across, splash his feet, get to the side. And he missed and fell into this pool. And the only person witnessing this drowning of my brother was a young little girl of about 3.5. And my father was looking out to sea for prawns, possibly. And she poked him and said, "He's fallen in the water."
In Rawalpindi, Mr. Divers, who was the chief steward at the time, was going through the dining room one evening at dinner time, and capon was being served. And one very charming lady turned to Mr. Divers and said, "Mr. Divers, what is a capon?" And he said, "Almost a gentleman, madam."
Parrots were quite well thought of. On the journey home, we brought a parrot. It was well received in this country as a present. And this cook had to take charge of them. And from time to time, it would appear that a parrot, not brought on in very good health perhaps, succumbed on the way, and the cook would have to tell the owner when she came up to see how the bird was doing that the bird was no more. And he would say, "Well, it does, since you're so moved by this, it does just so happen that I have a live parrot that I was taking home as a present, but you're so upset, I tell you what, you shall have mine." And so money passed, and she was given a parrot which looked very, very like her own, not surprisingly because it was. And all he was doing was making a useful little income out of the modest investment in one dead parrot, which he kept in the freezer.
Another chap did a hornpipe during a gale and broke his leg, fell off the stand. Spent the rest of the trip in plaster, yes.
Well, they were always very closely chaperoned, for one thing, and I remember more than once being invited to disclose by aunts or mothers what address I would be at in London to see whether I was a respectable type or not. And I would give an address, which, and they would say, "Well, that's a very good address." And then I was allowed to see more of the daughter or niece, as the case might be.
The fishing fleet was actually before the war. These ladies actually used to go to India, ostensibly on the search for husbands. And it amused me, actually. I think that the ones who never made husbands came back and they were called returned empties.
Well, we saw them. They all appeared in sort of very diaphanous clothes, and they refused to get dark in case they were considered to be niggers or wogs. So they wore very wide-brimmed hats, and they never got sunburnt like this. And they appeared like ghosts on a distant horizon now and then, very quiet. Looked like Agatha Christie wrote them all into a murder, and they all deserved to be. They all appeared mixing among these young lieutenants in this distant like this, and you'd hear an occasional distant laughter above the sound of the sea. Ha, 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 like this, you know what I mean? And they're always tinkering with some kind of cocktails on the decks.
I suppose on an average between London and we'll say Bombay, there would be a minimum of about 10 romances. Some even got married the minute they arrived in Bombay. That was how quick the romance blossomed.
Sex wasn't so important in those days, or looking for wives. No, it wasn't. It was just to have good fun. Certainly in my group, there wasn't anything like that. In fact, I don't think there was even the chaste kiss under the moon.
This was the supposedly carefree jazz age. But in 1931, Lord Inchcape delivered a chilling message to his board. It has been heartrending, he said, to see the steamers leaving London week after week with thousands of tons of unoccupied space. So different from the old days.
There may be trouble ahead. There may be trouble ahead. But while there's moonlight and music and love and romance. While there's love and romance. Let's face the music and dance. Let's face the music.
We were on our way to Alexandria, and war was imminent. And we silly young things thought it was marvelous, because the ship was blacked out and we were in convoy. And we got back to Britain about 8 days before war was declared. not realising that nearly all the officers on the ship, I think it was the Strathmore, would be killed.
With the outbreak of World War II, P&O ships were again requisitioned by the government, just as they had been 25 years earlier.
Of course, in those early days of the war, we were fitted with a 6-inch gun, and the vintage of our gun was 1906. And this was fitted on the stern of the ship, because the idea being that we were defensively equipped merchant ships, so we weren't attacking anything, we were defending ourselves if necessary.
It was all had no armour or anything like that, inch and a half-inch plating, and that was it. So, I mean, well, it was known as the Absolute Murder Club anyway.
The liner Rawalpindi of 17,000 tons was taken over by the Royal Navy, converted into an armed merchant cruiser, and sent on patrol in the waters off Iceland. Her job was to prevent enemy merchantmen returning from abroad to Germany. She was commanded by my father, Captain Edward Kennedy, who at the age of 60 had been pulled out of retirement after 17 years ashore. Towards the end of a murky afternoon on November the 23rd, 1939, the Rawalpindi sighted and was sighted by 2 German battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. She tried to escape, but lacked the speed, and after a brief and unequal engagement, she was set on fire and sunk. A few survivors were picked up by the Germans, and a few more next day by the Rawalpindi's sister ship, Chitral. But more than 300 were killed, including my father and 54 former P&O men.
When we entered the Mediterranean, the captain sent for me at daylight. And when I got on the bridge, this very senior man, because I was only the lowest of the low, said, "I'm sorry, laddie, to wake you, but this is a sight you'll never see again, and I think you ought to see it." There, in front of us, was the battle fleet. We were in the middle of this big passenger convoy of troop ships. Over on the starboard bow were about 60-odd ships of the cargo and the slow brigade, all got together, ready to split up. And all round us was a naval escort. Wherever you looked, there were ships. And as far as you could see on a perfectly clear day, there were ships. It was unbelievable.
P&O ships played a big part in the North African landings. The landings were successful, but on dispersal afterwards, the P&O ships were less fortunate. 7 were sunk, including the magnificent Viceroy of India.
In watching her go down, with all the windows and the decks, as she slowly slipped down, it did look like a country house sinking, and it was a distressing sight. She was one of the last of the really old ships that was built with teak and mahogany, no chromium plated. It was the past going, in actual fact, because Viceroy was never repeated.
In the whole of the war, the P&O lost no less than 19 ships, as in the First War, a quarter of its fleet. But this time there was to be no regeneration. Its remaining ships were in need of modernization, and repair and building costs had begun to escalate. It seemed to many the writing was on the wall.
The great change that came about after the Second World War was that the mail contracts were not renewed, and P&O found itself out in the big wide world all by itself. They, as a result, started to diversify. They had to build up their freights, they had to build up their passenger trade without the advantage of an empire, sending soldiers and statesmen all over the place.
With British merchant shipping now feeling the wind of competition from new rivals like Greece and Russia, P&O struggled to diversify. In the 50s, it bought oil tankers, but they were too many and too small. The most promising development in cutting costs was by transporting cargoes in containers which went direct from rail to ship. But the unions objected to it by going on strike. Next, P&O tried oil exploration, but the oil boom bubble burst. And the 10 liquid petroleum gas carriers it bought were too expensive and came too late. Yet, despite these setbacks, which were a serious drain on the company's resources, it somehow managed to survive. A few passenger liners were built, the most notable and the last being the Canberra. Her design was revolutionary, but business continued to fall off, and in 1973 she made her last journey as a scheduled liner.
By the time this ship came out in 1961, we were getting heavy competition from the airlines with their jets, 707s, and then, of course, later on the jumbos. So, really, P&O and the other passenger ship lines, they turned to kind of the leisure business, cruising. And that's what we've been in ever since, and I think been quite successful at.
But the clash between the ships I'd travelled on and the Canberra was entirely different. I mean, there was discos, there was forced entertainment everywhere you went. You had to do something somewhere. You weren't left alone. The lights on the decks were very bright, so you couldn't see the sea at night. There was no romance. And the decks were all glassed in, so you couldn't get the wind. And the windows were all sealed up like this. I wasn't that fond of it. It's for what do you call it? Touring, is it? Cruising. Cruising, yes, yes. Well, good.
Coordinated skirts and tops. The leather and white top is $12.95.
The company's remaining liners all became cruise ships, and it also bought the American line Princess Cruises. Standards and times were changing. But in 1982, Canberra went to war, taking 3,000 troops to the Falklands to end the Argentine invasion. They nicknamed her the Great White Whale. She was in the thick of the action in San Carlos water, but escaped unharmed. On her return, she was given a victor's welcome, and the country was justly proud. But by now, P&O was again in financial trouble, its share prices stagnant. And once again, the company looked for salvation outside its own ranks. Geoffrey Sterling was a self-made businessman who had built his own financial group, Sterling Guarantee Trust. He was already a non-executive director of P&O, and now he was invited to take over as chairman.
There was a moment when one had to consider whether we continued with Sterling Guarantee Trust, which some, particularly in the city, felt was part of tomorrow, and whether one stuck to P&O, which in some people's minds was part of yesterday. Frankly, as far as I was concerned, it didn't even take 5 seconds to come to the conclusion. Because, admittedly, perhaps a slightly sad day for myself personally, one's own company was going quiet. P&O was a name to contend with.
Sterling Guarantee Trust's interests include a firm of caterers, the Earl's Court Exhibition Hall, a property development company, and a group of shopping centres. So after Sterling took over P&O, the quartered flag, which once symbolised a great shipping company, came to represent a variety of enterprises, most of which have no connection with the sea.
Shipping is not the way I would describe it. In our transportation interests, our shipping businesses, if you want, the shipping interests are close to 40%. it is still a very major part of the group, and I think from the point of view of profile, even if we didn't have any ships for another 50 years, most people who asked what P&O was in, they would still regard this as being involved in shipping companies in various forms.
The group's most recent acquisition was the ill-fated Townsend Torrenson. For within a few weeks of P&O taking them over, one of their ferries, the Herald of Free Enterprise, capsized with huge loss of life soon after leaving the harbour of Zeebrugge.
I felt and still feel, I think I can only describe as a strong, dull anger. It should never have happened. And as far as I'm concerned, it will never happen again. As far as the company is concerned, it's a strange thing, but I suppose it must have been the same in war years. It's brought everybody closer together, and there's a sense of feeling that one has to be shoulder to shoulder, because obviously, because a few, in some form, which any time will state, let the side down, one can't really put that on the shoulders of everybody. And I think we will look back, if it wasn't for the actual tragedy, and realize that it has actually brought the group together in a way which probably few other things in life could.
This Tuesday, the Queen went on board one of the company's most modern cruise liners, the Pacific Princess, moored in the Thames off Greenwich's Royal Naval College, to join in the celebrations of P&O's 150th birthday. Yet the fireworks were both celebratory and valedictory. For the great days of P&O, whose ships once served an empire that covered a quarter of the globe, have gone forever. Its future lies not just in holiday cruises and ferries and containerization, but in supermarkets and trade fairs, catering and property development.
As far as I'm concerned, P&O really is locked up in the archives. What's happened to it since has nothing to do with it being the lifeline of empire.
I'll fly me to the moon, play among the stars, and let me see what spring is like, Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand.
I look back occasionally with those a wee bit of nostalgia.
Yeah, in other words, darling, kiss me. Fill my heart with song, sing forevermore. And you are all I long for, all I worship, I adore.
And I'm very pleased to see it still doing a shipping company, and I'm very pleased to see the P&O flag on the funnel again.
In other words, please be true. Yeah, in other words, I love you.
I have never any nostalgia. Tomorrow is another day.
Ooh, I love you.